Good morning, everyone, and I'm very excited today to welcome Professor James Leibold. James Leibold is a professor of politics at the La Trobe University in Australia. His research focuses on contemporary China and its policies towards ethnic minorities, particularly the Tibetan and the Uyghur communities. He studies the politics of ethnic policymaking, particularly along China's western frontiers. And he's also explored concerns of Chinese new media, censorship, expression of ethnic identities on social media. Closer home, a few years ago, he co-taught China Wired, Politics of New Media with Professor Sonika as part of a Gyan course at IIT Madras. His talk today is titled Smelting the Nation, Coercive Nation Building in Xi Jinping's New Era. We're super excited to have you here today, Professor James. Thank you so much for doing this talk with us, and over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that introduction. And yeah, thank you to Professor Gupta for the invitation to speak to you once again. As you mentioned, I had the great pleasure of being graciously hosted at IIT Madras. I think it was back in 2019, where I taught a subject with Sonika on Wired China. I wish I could be back there with you. I really enjoyed my time in India and Chennai. Your amazing food, your colorful politics, I've never seen anything quite like the Indian news media in action. Of course, I have a deep and abiding love for cricket. Unfortunately, there wasn't any cricket on at the time, but I'm very much, as I'm sure everyone there is, looking forward to the World Cup that's going to be hosted in Australia in a week's time. Yeah, maybe the best team win, and we'll look for some really great competition on the field. So what I understand your class is looking at contemporary Tibet. I want to focus my lecture, I guess, on the kind of wider policy setting to kind of zoom out. First I'll zoom in, but then zoom out to look at some of the ways in which there's been a rather dramatic shift in the way the Chinese Communist Party frames and seeks to solve the so-called minzu, or ethnic question, and the way we've gone from really an approach that was based on accommodation and ethnic autonomy in the 1980s to really a kind of coercive, assimilative approach today under Xi Jinping. And I'm happy at the end to take any questions that people might have. I've got a few PowerPoint slides, so I might endeavor to share my screen.
I think you should be able to share your screen. Perfect.
Yeah. Is that coming up? Can people see that?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. Well, I actually started as a historian, and my early research was really looking at Chinese nationalist leaders during the transition from the Qing Empire to the nation state. And I've had a particular interest in Dr. Sun Yat-sen, who is considered the Guofu, or the father of the modern Chinese nation. In his really famous Three People's Principles set of lectures that he delivered in 1924, he used the Chinese phrase, a loose sheet of sand, to characterize the Chinese people. And he argued that they lacked a single shared national spirit, and lacked also social and cultural cohesiveness. What Sun and many other Chinese nationalists believed, and I would say this holds true for both the past and the present, was that the state needed to quite literally smelt these fine grains of sand together in a single furnace to create what Sun Yat-sen termed a single guozu, a term that I've translated as a state race because it has real biological undertones. In fact, of the key characteristics of the guozu, Sun Yat-sen listed a shared bloodline as the single most important one. And this is something I've argued that Xi Jinping would agree with today. Yeah, one of the first, oh, and I'm off one slide. So yeah, anyway, my metaphor is Dr. Sun Yat-sen and this idea of renghua or smelting of the state race. But rather ironically, one of the first acts of the new Republican state that Sun led as provisional president in 1912 was to adopt this five-colored national flag that was supposed to symbolize both the unity and the equality of the five main races of the Chinese nation, the Han majority, but as well as the Tibetans, the Chinese Muslims, the Mongols, and the Manchurian minorities. So why, if Sun believed that China needed to smelt these people together in a single furnace, did the state adopt this flag? Well, in short, Sun was opposed to this flag. He had his own version, and he was pushed aside quite quickly as president. But the abiding kind of reality at the time was the fact that the Chinese state was weak and its non-Han minorities, while a really tiny fraction of the population, only about 4 or 5% at the time, they inhabited roughly 60% of the new Chinese state's territory. And thus, in the eyes of nationalists like Sun Yat-sen, the project of smelting the nation was going to be a long-term one. It was going to take time, and it needed a powerful state with assets at its disposal. In Sun's mind, one of those key assets to literally stitch the nation together was going to be railways. And in fact, when he was pushed aside as president, he took for a short period of time the position as Minister of Railways. And it was during that time that he sketched out this rather ambitious plan for a network of railways that would transcourse the Chinese nation and literally stitch it together. He referred to these railways as literally the veins of the Guozu. And what's quite remarkable, if you compare that to China's national railway system today, is they've been able to largely accomplish this really ambitious project, including, as we know, a railway line from Qinghai into Lhasa that's been extended now to Shigatsu, and now another railway line going from Sichuan into China. And this is no easy feat given the altitude and the difficulty of construction on the plateau. This really underpins what I've argued is a really pragmatic and a patient approach that was ultimately used by early Chinese state leaders as they sought to manage the ethnic diversity within their territory. To give you just another example, this guy, Liu Baocheng, the so-called one-eyed general, during the Long March in 1934, General Liu Baocheng drank a so-called chicken blood oath with the leader of the Yi barbarians, a gentleman called Xiao Yedan, and became blood brothers and equals. This kind of symbolized that unity of different ethnic groups. But if we really strip this incident of its mythology, what we see is a kind of tired and hungry Red Army providing the Yi with weapons and bullets in exchange for safe passage through their territory and assistance for putting some valuable miles behind in front of the pursuing nationalist troops. And it was really that journey, rather arduous journey through the Sichuan highlands where they encountered not only Yi, but also Tibetan nomads, that the CCP realized that it needed to adopt a really pragmatic and opportunistic approach to its policy towards non-Han minority communities that inhabited this really vast and valuable frontier region. So in exchange for loyalty and acceptance of Chinese Communist Party rule, the party would provide the ethnic minority elites with material and symbolic recompense, everything from money, autonomy, titles, jobs, and upward social mobility. It was a bit of a social contract of sorts. And these policies, which were partially inherited from the Bolsheviks, were implemented during the 1950s and then institutionalized and legalized during the 1980s after the Cultural Revolution. Yet these really pragmatic and, one could argue, highly progressive policies have recently not only fallen out of favor in Beijing, but are being systematically overturned. Why, you might ask, this dramatic change in approach to policy? Well, that's a complex question. I think one big key variable is the fact that China now is an increasingly rich and powerful country, and the ruling Chinese Communist Party now has more resources, time, and ability to assert its control over every square kilometer of its territory, literally peering into each and every remote village and household now. In short, it now has the power to try to accomplish what Sun Yat-sen once envisioned, the smelting of its citizens, Han and majority alike, into a single state race. Yet, at the same time, the party is also deeply insecure and fears enemies abroad and within. And thus, there's a real sense of urgency towards this colonial project of control and transformation. And this stretches not only to Tibet in the far west and Xinjiang in the far north, but also into Mongolia, as well as Hong Kong, which we've recently witnessed a pretty dramatic crackdown, and ultimately, quite possibly, the transformation of Taiwan, if and when the Chinese Communist Party seizes control of the island. This, inherently colonial project seeks to transform, as I said, the kind of physical and human geography of China, and is really deeply rooted in the political culture of China, its history of what you might call ethnic majority chauvinism, tendency to see peripheral peoples as backward and in need of yielding to superior Chinese culture and traditions. And its impact now is really being seen, as I said, across all of China. I just want to briefly touch on some concrete examples of these policy changes as it relates to first Xinjiang and then Tibet. So I'm not sure if, how many people are familiar with Xinjiang. I know you guys are focused on Tibet, but it's the other really massive in terms of size, but also sparsely populated territory in the far west of China. I mean, it's worth remembering that Xinjiang is closer to Moscow than it is to Beijing. So culturally and even geographically, it is very much peripheral to Chinese culture and civilization. And now China, the Chinese state began to colonize the region during the Qing dynasty, and it named the region an official province in 1884. And under the Qing and the subsequent Republican and PRC state, Han settlers were moved into the region, and China's Han ethnic majority comprised now about 40% of the region's territory. And this is this transmigration of Han settlers into the region was done quite systematically in the case of Xinjiang through the establishment of something called the Xinjiang Construction and Production Corp that was established by Mao in the 1950s to literally to settle and to transform the region by bringing Han settlers into the region. This it's important to note, didn't happen in the case of Tibet. And if there's anything that has probably saved Tibet from complete swamping of Han Chinese, its altitude and the belief, I think there is some medical evidence to this, that Han Chinese people don't adapt very well to living on the plateau. And as a result, the Tibetan population has remained a solid majority But this certainly wasn't the case in Xinjiang, with a really important shift of the population. So you go from a Han population of around 5% in 1949 to now, as I said, 40%, meaning the Uyghurs are almost a minority in their own region today. Yet, as I was pointing out, during the 1950s, the Chinese Communist Party adopted this really pragmatic, if not progressive approach, and declared in 1955 the creation of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. And it claimed that it was going to allow the Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities to be masters of their own home. And this included the official recognition of the Uyghurs as a nationality on par with the ethnic majority, as well as providing them with a range of preferential policies aimed at assisting with their development. Yet as Chinese state capacity increased during the post-Mao period, the Han colonial project re-emerged and re-intensified, sparking a cycle of kind of indigenous resistance and state crackdown that really marks the kind of the modern history of Xinjiang. As Xi Jinping came to power in 2012 and 2013, the violence once again escalated across Xinjiang with a spate of deadly terror attacks. This included a rather horrific attack on a train station in the southern city of Kunming on the 1st of March 2014, when 8 Uyghurs brutally attacked passengers at the train station, killing 31 innocent civilians and wounding 143 people. Many inside China refer to this as China's 9/11 moment. In response, Chinese President Xi Jinping announced a people's war on terror and called on Xinjiang authorities to show no mercy in rounding up everyone that should be rounded up. His key lieutenant was Chen Chengguo, who began to build a network of re-education camps, sprawling prison-like facilities with barbed wire and watchtowers, and then started to round up Uyghurs and other Turkic-speaking Muslim minorities and placing them in these facilities without legal recourse. This is a satellite photo of the sprawling Dabachang facility outside of Urumqi, which covers over 5 square kilometers in size. It's estimated to be able to hold at least 10,000 or more detainees. It more recently, so it expanded, and you can go onto Google Earth and watch the way in which this expanded quite dramatically during the re-education campaign. It has more recently been converted into an official prison, and a journalist from AP, Dave Kong, actually visited this facility 2 years ago. He, I think, described it at the time in his story as the world's largest detention center. And the scale of it is just really quite dramatic. We have testimony for those who've been released from these camps of compulsory classes in Mandarin Chinese, as well as legal education classes, as well as psychological and physical torture and sexual abuse inside these camps. It's quite common to extrajudicial detention across the globe. But these re-education camps, which have attracted widespread international condemnation, including a recent report by the UN Human Rights Commission, are really just one aspect of a widespread and multi-pronged approach at social re-engineering. And this includes other features. Again, many of them have received quite extensive media coverage, such as in really intrusive surveillance, both in terms of automated surveillance as well as human surveillance. This is everything from facial recognition cameras to AI-driven hardware to monitor people's actions 24/7. There's also been the systematic and horrific destruction of indigenous language, culture, and religious practices. The use of the Uyghur language is constitutionally protected in China, but it's now been all but pushed out of schools, offices, and public squares. It's now being viewed as unpatriotic for Uyghurs to speak their own language in their own homeland. We've also seen mosque shrines and even cemeteries desecrated. Cultural practices like Islamic greetings, headscarves, and beards are now viewed as signs of religious extremism and grounds for being detained and sent off for re-education. There's also been an effort to dilute the size and concentration of the indigenous population, particularly in southern Xinjiang, through a stricter family planning enforcement that minorities in southern Xinjiang had to undergo starting in 2017. We've also seen efforts to incentivize the migration of Han settlers into Xinjiang. So through this, the XPCC that I mentioned before. There's also been the transfer of Uyghurs and other minorities to other provinces for education and work. So again, to try to dilute the concentration, particularly in southern Xinjiang, where most Uyghurs used to live. And then finally, there's the encouragement of interethnic marriage, which is really seen as kind of the standard of a healthy form of social cohesion. And so it's a benchmark, a matrix on which the party evaluates its success in achieving this social re-engineering project. There's also been, particularly starting in 2020, a dramatic increase in formal incarceration of Uyghurs and other minorities in Xinjiang. Presumably these are individuals that were deemed immune to re-education. And we've seen the construction of new prisons and a dramatic surge in arrest trials in prison sentences over the last couple of years. And then finally, there's the issue of forced or coerced labor. The party, as a part of Xi Jinping's poverty alleviation program, has coerced Uyghurs and other minorities into labor assignments. Some of them have been reassigned jobs inside of Xinjiang, whether it be in the cotton fields or in the factories of Urumqi, as well as sent to factories across China. They're forced to kind of work and under conditions that are suggestive of forced labor. With work on the factory assembly line being another form of control, disciplining and reprogramming for Uyghurs. More importantly, I guess these coerced labor assignments make the Chinese government's re-education program far more economically sustainable, if not downright profitable, where the re-education, the construction of re-education camps and the housing of these people was incredibly expensive and taxing on the Xinjiang economy. So there's an attempt to kind of move in a new direction by bringing people into the labor force in forms that are conducive or suggestive of forced labor. And just turning to Tibet, there's no evidence that I'm aware of that the Chinese Communist Party resorted to the mass internment of Tibetans across the Tibetan plateau. But they have chiefly adopted many of the same policies following the violence and instability that erupted in Lhasa in 2008, and then again during the transition to power under Xi Jinping in 2012, 2013. Chiefly in the form, and some of you might be aware of, and you probably discussed the rather horrific self-immolations that occurred across the plateau. But as I said, many of the same policies that were implemented in Xinjiang have been also implemented in the case of Tibet. This includes the kind of gradual erasure of Tibetan culture, linguistic and religious practices, given its sparse population, the use of high-tech surveillance, has been crucial for the ability of the party to garrison, monitor, and transform the region. Before shifting across to Xinjiang, Chen Chengguo was actually the party's secretary in Tibet, and he pioneered many of the policy innovations that were then implemented in Xinjiang. This included the massive increase in the size of the police force through the creation of thousands of street corner and village-based police stations where the police were to function as the kind of eyes and ears of the Chinese Communist Party. He also designed the policy and dispatched thousands of party cadre-based work teams to live in remote Tibetan communities beginning in 2013. These teams undertook intensive surveillance of people, carried out widespread political education, and monitored anyone believed to be a threat for social stability. The kind of sparse nature of Tibet has long been a challenge for the party state, with a smaller Han population there. And so these cadre work teams were a key part of the human surveillance that accompanied the automated surveillance I was talking about before. The party has also made really significant changes in the area of labor and education. We've also seen coercive labor assignments in the case of Tibet, with Tibetans forced to work in factories or construction sites across the Tibetan Autonomous Region, as well as transferred for work assignments across China. We've also seen really significant changes in terms of the education system in Tibet. We've seen the gradual phasing out of private monastic education in the Tibetan language, and now pretty much the eradication of Tibetan medium education, which it should be noted as a constitutional right, with students now required to study from standardized textbooks that are written in Mandarin Chinese. Furthermore, a recent report by the Tibetan Action Institute estimated that 1 million Tibetan students as young as 4 years of age have been coerced into attending state boarding schools where contact with their native communities is essentially severed, and they're taught to act, think, and behave like members of the Han majority. And while state boarding schools are used across China, it's estimated around 80% of Tibetan students are in these state boarding schools, as opposed to 20% for Han students. And then finally, and again, kind of recently, the Human Rights Watch, as well as the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto, has recently documented the systematic collection of forensic DNA samples from the entire population across Tibet. And these efforts not only violate privacy rights, they also represent the only example that I'm aware of mass DNA collection by a nation state outside of major criminal investigations. So these rather dramatic changes in state policy in Xinjiang and Tibet over the last decade are driven, I've argued, by kind of an irrational fear of instability and dismemberment, and also a belief that the party needs to play a far more active role in smelting the state race together, building the ideological, cultural, and social fabric of what Xi Jinping now calls the communal consciousness of the Chinese race. Yet these policy shifts also go well beyond Tibet and Xinjiang, and really are part of a kind of fundamental rethink about how the party manages ethno-cultural diversity. So a real departure from the pragmatism of Liu Baocheng and a return to the idealism of Sun Yat-sen. So following the rather dramatic collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, a group of intellectuals and policy members began to warn that China could follow in the footsteps of the USSR and the former Yugoslavia and collapse along its ethnic seams if it didn't adopt a radically different set of policies as related to nation building. As mentioned before, the spate of violence that erupted in Lhasa and Urumqi really kind of rocked the party leadership, particularly during the sensitive time of the transition to the current president, Xi Jinping. You had high-profile public intellectuals like Professor Ma Rong at Beijing University calling on the government to have a fundamental rethink about its ethnic policies. Ma argued that China had essentially created a kind of dual structure, China of the Han majority and then the China of its 55 ethnic minorities, with separate homelands, schools, languages, cultural customs, civic rights, legal identities, and even political representation. This dual structure really amplified, he argued, the ethnocultural differences and contributed to social conflict and a general lack of mutual interactions and understanding. The lack of social and national cohesion, he argued, could lead to the collapse of China, and thus required a kind of urgent diminution of ethnic differences, new policies aimed at actively encouraging inter-ethnic contact, exchange and mingling, and even the active forging of a shared consciousness. Other scholar officials like Huang Gang and Hu Lianhe argued for a so-called second generation of ethnic policies in 2011, one that would attenuate ethnic differences and strengthen a single shared national racial identity. And they returned to Sun Yat-sen and used this term of guozu, which really had fallen out of favor. In their eyes, you know, the China needed to depart from the former Soviet Union's approach to ethnic policies and go with the kind of what they argue is the global norm of the melting pot. Again, like Barong warned, if China didn't make this shift, that it could share the fate of the Soviet Union. So that's kind of the intellectual backdrop to Xi Jinping's appointment as party secretary. And while ethnic issues was not the first issue on his policy agenda, I think anti-corruption was probably a foremost important. Pretty early on in his tenure, in 2014, he convened a very important meeting in Beijing called the Central Ethnic Work Conference, where he outlined his vision for a new direction in ethnic policies. Despite declaring that China's current policies had been successful, he also called for new thinking and new methods, which was widely interpreted as suggesting a new direction in policy. While there's no longer talk of a second generation of ethnic policies, and important key legal provisions like the 1984 law on regional ethnic autonomy, as well as the protections in the Constitution have remained in force, the party under Xi has steadily implemented a new set of policies aimed at finally achieving Sun Yat-sen's dream of melding the guozu together. I've identified in some of my writing 7 key changes that you can see in ethnic policy across China. These are subtle, gradual changes, but they have really almost changed the direction of policy fundamentally over the course of the last decade. And I might just sketch them out really quite quickly, but I'm very keen to kind of get to your questions, but I'll just go through them really quickly. The first is really important, institutional changes. So China has a party state structure a kind of dual structure. And as a result, it has different organs responsible for implementing ethnic policies. In the past, the State Ethnic Affairs Commission, which is a state council body, was responsible for implementing these policies. And it really had an agenda of preserving ethnic cultures, languages, and traditions. In this new Xi era, where the emphasis is on the party leading all, its power was pretty much stripped and handed over to a key CCP institution called the United Front Work Department, which really not only now supervises the State Ethnic Affairs Commission, but really runs and dictates policy in the current era. And we've seen some important symbolic changes as well, like the State Ethnic Affairs Commission was always headed by an ethnic minority elite, but in the appointment in 2020 of Chen Xiaojiang, the leadership of that organ changed from the Mongolian Batar to the Han official Chen. We've also seen a weakening of ethnic base quotas. So one of the key parts of the previous policy was to provide the ethnic minorities with a kind of stake in the system. And this was through a range of affirmative action policies. So everything from special educational opportunities to business opportunities, as well as political representation. So every year at the National People's Congress, you see photos of representatives dressed in their colorful ethnic costumes. And this is a way of providing, upward social mobility for ethnic minorities. There's evidence that these appointments are, they were always symbolic, but they are becoming increasingly rare and less proportional in the case of China, particularly at the key apexes of political power. So if we look at the Politburo Standing Committee, as well as the Politburo, there's not a single non-Han official on those bodies. And there's currently only one party secretary of a provincial level organ that is a non-Han individual. And this person is a member of the Bai minority, Shen Qingying, who is also a woman. And I was listening the other day to some analysis that was suggesting that she may be appointed as the kind of sole minority and token female representative of the Politburo at the upcoming 20th Party Congress. We've also seen some important changes to representation at ethnic institutions, or so-called minzu universities, that were created to really promote the educational advancement as well as the protection of minority cultures and traditions. So there were institutions for ethnic minorities that now are increasingly catering to the Han ethnic majority. And so these erosions of ethnic-based quotas is a kind of fundamental undermining of the previous policy and this kind of social contract with ethnic minorities. There are also individuals who are beginning to question the validity and the necessity of the system of regional ethnic autonomy that was created during the 1950s. At its apex, around 71% of China's minority population lived in one of these autonomous regions that covered about 64% of Chinese territory. And you can see it here in this map. And inside those autonomous regions, there were real opportunities, genuine opportunities for autonomy and social advancement for ethnic minorities. And while Xi Jinping has stated on the public record that this system is a fundamental part of the Chinese political system, there's still voices such as Professor Mao Rong, who are calling for its removal, calling it obsolete and out of step with China's constitution. And even he has even criticized Xi Jinping obliquely by arguing that there's a real danger in having a single voice or adopting the so-called two whatever policies, which was the policy of whatever Mao said and whatever Mao did that was criticized after the Cultural Revolution. And so it was a pretty oblique but pretty clear attack on Xi Jinping. So he's being pushed by segments of the population to push even further in this shift on ethnic policies. I mentioned a scaling back of affirmative action policies. So two of the most important ones that minorities used to receive are extra points on the Gaokao, or the university entrance exam. So it's an incredibly important, ultra competitive process for educational social mobility. So in order to provide minorities with a kind of leg up, they were provided with extra points on the exam and additional places at top universities. So these policies have been or are, as we speak, being scaled back in most provinces. And students are being made to kind of compete on an even playing field that's going to have important implications for education and social mobility. The other important affirmative action policy that minorities used to have is exemptions from the one-child policy. That these have now been scrapped, and China moved first, as some of you would be aware of, to a kind of universal two-birth policy, and now just in the last year or so to now a universal three-birth policy. And this reflects the declining birth rates in China. Many people talk about a looming kind of demographic crisis. But we've seen, as I mentioned before, in the case of Xinjiang, an effort to, despite a kind of liberalization of birth policy across China, to tighten birth control policies amongst Uyghurs and Tibetans. Many of the Uyghur women and Tibetan women, particularly those of a lower socioeconomic background, are seen to be having too many children, and too many children of a so-called lower quality nature, which is seen as a source of instability. So we've seen a kind of complete reversal as it comes to family planning as it relates to minorities. And then there's also been, and again, I touched on this when I spoke about Xinjiang and Tibet, a real assault on ethnic languages and cultures. There has been an effort to universalize Putonghua medium education in the name of so-called bilingual education. So in the past, it was possible for a Tibetan or Uyghur to study in their native language from primary school through to postgraduate studies at one of these minzu universities. This is no longer the case. I mean, technically, it's still possibly conceivable, but school children from preschool now are being instructed in Putonghua or Mandarin Chinese, leaving less room and less space for them to preserve their mother tongues. We've seen this pushed across ethnic areas. So there was a language protest that erupted in Inner Mongolia in 2020, but also changes in southern China. We've also seen the assault and rectification of mosques, shrines, and monasteries in the name of Sinicizing religion, and real changes to architecture. And then finally, we've seen the ramping up of standardized patriotic education across China. Xi Jinping really sees education as the kind of front lines on his efforts to forge this communal consciousness? I mean, how do you get people to begin to think and act the same way? Well, it starts with education, and it starts, as she said, from babies, a term that he's literally used. And he's called on educators to plant the seed of the love for the Zhonghua, or the Chinese nation, deep in the souls of each and every child. We've seen, real efforts to standardize the textbooks, as well as introduce a new required subject on Xi Jinping thought that's been implemented across China. So in some, we've really seen a really dramatic shift in policies since the 1980s. This has occurred gradually, really beginning during the 1990s in the wake of the Tiananmen Square demonstrations and the collapse of the Soviet Union, but really has gathered pace under Xi Jinping and really correlates with his shift towards authoritarianism. There's a correlation, I believe, between authoritarian politics and a lack of tolerance for ethnocultural diversity. And through the strengthening of the party state, we've seen its really assertive approach to try to transform and re-engineer its ethnic minority populations. And thus far, it's been able to do that with very little resistance, because it has thrown tremendous resources at this problem. It doesn't mean that resistance isn't still there, but what we're seeing is that essentially it's being bottled up at the moment, and could burst forward if instability were to return, which is a real possibility, because Xi does face some real challenges as he heads into his third term as Chinese president. So I will leave it at that, and really welcome any questions or comments that you guys have.
Any questions, guys? Yeah, go for it, Janita.
So my question is, scholars who are asking for communal consciousness, a united consciousness, and call for this disparity, or what they call as disparity. So is it shared by the, is the spirit shared by the population as well? They share this idea, and is it mutually reinforcing the city's need for a united front, and for the population's desire to get to remove all the disparity?
Yeah, it was a little bit muffled, your question, but I think I understood it to mean to what extent is there popular support outside party officials for this shift in policy. While it's very difficult to kind of gauge what the ordinary Chinese person thinks about anything. We don't really have good public polling data, nor adequate access due to issues around censorship and control to fully understand what the ordinary Chinese person thinks. But from anecdotal evidence, including my own, when I was living in China during from 2012 until 2015, I would say most Han Chinese have a kind of unconscious racial bias against ethnic minority populations, particularly Tibetans and Uyghurs, who look different and are considered to be less assimilated into the Chinese nation. And a big part of this is the lack of any kind of public discussion about, in any meaningful way, about racial discrimination or ethnic discrimination, whatever you want to call it, in China. I reflect on the way in which these issues, I mean, these are really universal issues. Every country that has a diverse population has to somehow manage to deal with that diversity. And one of the starting points for dealing with it is to have a kind of a public discussion about racism, how it occurs, how it can be institutionalized. And those conversations have never been had in China. And so that's a real barrier for understanding. I mean, during the 1980s, when China embraced a kind of multicultural politic, it was done in a really kind of cliche, almost kind of voyeuristic way, in which people would consume the ethnic other for their own kind of pleasure. You know, Han Chinese people love ethnic songs and costumes, but it's done in a really superficial way that doesn't begin to grapple with the systemic bias that exists in the institutional forms of racism that exist. And now in the kind of current era where there's such focus on nationalism and an obsession with social stability, most Han Chinese agree that Xi Jinping needed to crack down in Xinjiang because the problem with terrorism was out of control, and this would lead to instability. And the only way to respond was through a kind of heavy-handed approach. Yeah, a good question. My feeling is that most ordinary Han Chinese are fully behind these policies. And my belief as well is that the party state believe that these policies, this new approach has been largely successful. And I can't see any indications that there would be a U-turn in the near future, certainly under Xi Jinping.
Are there any other questions? Professor James, if I could ask you a couple of questions. One, how has the pandemic, what has the pandemic done for this kind of movement in ethnic policy? Has it facilitated some of this biopolitical control that you were discussing? And the second part of my question is, how does the state deal with, spectacle forms of resistance like self-immolations? Because that does, from an outside perspective, you would think that, that poses a very public challenge to the CCP's ethnic minority policies.
Yeah, two really good questions. Yeah, there's no doubt that the COVID pandemic has provided the party state with a kind of license to innovate and push further its use of high-tech forms of surveillance as a tool of social control. It has really innovated in using mobile phone tracking data to monitor the movement of people, as well as the interaction of peoples. We've seen that really across the board of China, but some of those technologies came out of earlier pioneering efforts in Xinjiang, but really we have a kind of two-way flow where they're probably kind of perfected elsewhere and then re-exported back into places like Xinjiang and Tibet. At the same time, I've argued that when we think about surveillance, at least until recently, most of the surveillance in Tibet and Tibet in particular, but Xinjiang as well, has been human surveillance rather than high-tech surveillance. And part of it is just about the logistics of doing this in a remote place, and the fact that the party state actually does have a lot of bodies that it can throw at this issue. And so there's this program that's been implemented in both Xinjiang and Tibet called this village-based work teams that literally have been sent to remote villages to live for a year at a time to monitor local populations, to help transform their thinking and keep a close eye on any troublemakers. So yeah, the pandemic, I think, is in many regards have been a real game changer. I think the other big aspect of that is China's COVID zero approach, and it's really kind of backed itself in a corner that I'm not sure it really knows how to get out of, and it's having severe impacts on the economy. And if there's anything, the real weakness that Xi has, it's this kind of Faustian bargain that the Chinese Communist Party had with its citizens, that if the citizens remain loyal to the party will provide them with economic opportunities and social mobility. I mean, that's the fundamental bargain that the party initiated in the post-Mao period. And for the first time, it's starting to fray because of the slowing of the economy. And a big part of that is the COVID zero approach. But when you back yourself in a corner like that, it's hard to see how you reverse course, particularly because it's been a key policy of Xi. And in terms of your second question, the spectacle of self-immolations, certainly there's a long tradition within Buddhism of self-immolations as a form of protests. We had seen them in the past, but nothing on the scale of what we saw in 2000, from 2010 up until 2012. It certainly generated a lot of public discussion, a lot of angst, and I think it was a real source of embarrassment for the Chinese Communist Party because of the horrific kind of spectacle of it. So the first thing they tried to do is, and this is kind of the playbook that they always turn to, is to try to censor information coming out about it, particularly images. Second, it really strengthened its kind of local policing and prevention methods to prevent people from carrying out these protests, self-immolations, as well as punishing families whose relatives were engaged in this process of protest. And the fact that they stopped rather suddenly and rather dramatically, I think, is quite telling. Is it because that sense of despair and opposition to policies were eliminated or addressed? I think highly unlikely. If anything, we can see that the party's pushed further in its policies of assimilation. So the way I read that, the end of those self-immolations is the effectiveness of the party's surveillance and control mechanisms, which have really eliminated that form of protest rather effectively. But there's, again, just touching on the point I was making before, I don't think that these forms of resistance have completely been snuffed out, and under the right conditions, I suspect they will come back. And really, we'll have to wait and see how long Xi Jinping can remain in power. The biggest weakness of any authoritarian state is that of power transition. At some stage, he's going to get old, if not die rather suddenly, and leave a real power vacuum in which not only you see major instability across the Han majority, but it will also be an opportunity for ethnic minorities to resist once again, and maybe even seek retaliation or revenge. So it could be quite bloody at some stage.
Thank you so much, Professor James. Are there any last questions before we round off the event? Thank you so much, Professor James, for taking the time to do this talk with us today. It was absolutely fascinating. And I think I speak for all the students here as well, that we've learned so much. There's going to be a lot for us to look into further. But I think this has also given us some very important perspective onto the ways in which ethnic minorities are managed in China today. I think it's a perspective that was much needed for the class as well. So thank you so much for doing this. And I really hope we can do this in person again soon. hopefully.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you very much for the invitation. I hope you guys have a great day there, and
Thank you.
take care.